please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
You're with me, Sri Jagaraj, on a Monday morning on Squawk Box. It's 8:30 a.m. in Singapore and Hong Kong. Hong Kong, China closed today, actually, as China celebrates its National Day and we mark the start of the Golden Week holiday in the mainland. Here's how Japan is doing. It is open. Not a great deal of traction for the Nikkei 225. We're up by about 30 points, so negligible, despite the fact that September quarter Tankan was actually pretty reasonable and beating expectations. Let's give you dollar yen as well, 112.65, so it hasn't really changed since pre-Tankan as well, but the real star today is the Aussie market. But remember, we are witnessing very, very light trading conditions for Aussie equities. People have been injured after riot police used batons and rubber bullets to try and stop the referendum from taking place. Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy declared the vote illegal, calling it a mockery of democracy, and said he would call on all parties for talks. Catalan region's president remained defiant, saying Catalonia has won the right to statehood. Among those who did cast their vote for independence, Barcelona football player Gerard Piqué, speaking to reporters after he voted. A clearly emotional Piqué saying he would even step down from the national team if he had to.
I think this is a right that we have to defend with every law in our hands. I am and I feel Catalan, and today, more than ever, I feel proud of Catalonia's people. Their behaviour was extraordinary, just like during the last 7 years. If a coach or any official of the Federation thinks I am a problem or disruptive, I don't have a problem to step down and leave Spain's national team before 2018.
Let's bring in Antonio Fatas now, Professor of Economics at INSEAD. Antonio, are we witnessing the makings of a constitutional crisis in your country, in Spain?
I mean, it's a constitutional crisis as we speak. You have a local government that has decided to declare independence. Independence has no space in the Spanish constitution, and that's what the national government is saying. But at this point, it's very hard to imagine an easy way out of this when both parties have stated lines that basically there's no intersection between the two spaces, between what each of them want.
There are wrongs and rights here, obviously, as you were saying, but it's clear to me that Mariano Rajoy seems to have crossed the Rubicon here. There's no turning back. In a way, arguably, he is almost legitimising the independence activists and legitimising Catalonia. This is going to generate more sympathy for them.
I mean, it's going to generate more sympathy for the Catalan government, both nationally and internationally. At the same time, one has to put ourselves in the position of a government that is facing some illegal activity in one of the regions of the country. And it's very difficult to know exactly when to enforce the law and when not to enforce the law to take care of, so like, the image that the country causes. So I think both of them are in a very difficult situation, and unless they find a way to negotiate and find a potential outcome out, I think this is going to stretch for a long time, and it's going to cause both social, political and economic disruption.
Do you think that there is scope for a negotiated settlement here? Because the Catalan authorities say 90% of Catalans voted yes. That's a considerable expression of independence. They have basically unilaterally declared independence. Where do we go from here?
I mean, the polls don't say 90% of Catalans support independence. The polls are closer to 50-50. It's just the people who voted are the ones who are in favor of independence. But the problem is the Catalan government so far has said this is not a negotiation. We're just declaring independence. That's something that Spain would never accept. So at this point, it's very difficult to know what the negotiation will lead to.
Let's talk about the economic implications here, because Catalonia is an economically significant region of Spain, represents about a fifth of GDP. Tourism is big there. It's an industrial heartland. The Catalans have threatened a strike. Are we looking at a winter of discontent in Spain? And how badly is this going to affect the broader economy?
I mean, at a minimum, you have increased uncertainty. At a minimum, you have social disruption, strikes. That's at a minimum. In the worst case scenario, you're going to have a serious breakout of the country. You're going to have a serious economic crisis in the country. Again, it all depends on how far people can go in their negotiations and how flexible they will be in the stated position so far.
What's your baseline expectation?
I think this is going to take at least 2 months to figure out, 2 months of uncertainty and crisis, and then we'll see whether people are willing to move.
And if there is political uncertainty, it looks as though this issue isn't going to be laid to rest anytime soon, associated with Spain. That's going to impact the euro, is it? That's going to impact Spanish bond markets. And is it going to impact the ECB's normalisation?
I think it will impact, again, the whole region. Spain is a very large part of the euro area. It's one of the large countries of the euro area. And if this continues and the uncertainty continues, it could certainly have an effect on the nice economic recovery we're seeing over the last year.
So there's going to be a perceptions and a sentiment impact here. But could it delay normalisation by the ECB? Because the sense that I get is that if the politics remain an issue, if this is another proverbial brick in the wall of worry in Europe, then does that mean that the ECB needs to stay in the game in order to backstop some of these peripheral bond markets?
I mean, I think in the next couple of months, you're not going to see any economic data that will tell the ECB goes low. But if this continues, you would see later, probably 6 months from now, the possibility of the Spanish economy slowing down, and that will affect the euro economy for sure.
October the 26th is when the ECB meets. Prior to all of this, the crisis in Catalonia, there was a sense that this was going to be a live meeting. Normalisation would be announced and rolled out early 2018. Does that still stand, Antonio?
I think at this point it does. Unless something happens over the next days, which I don't expect, I think it does.
All right. Domino effect. Will Catalonia embolden independence movements elsewhere in the European Union, and could it have implications for the Scots?
Well, it could certainly even impact other regions in Spain. There's the Basque region in Spain that certainly would be willing to do something similar if this ends up leading to independence in Catalonia. And of course, there are other regions across Europe that might say, well, why not? Why don't we follow the same route?
Is Mariano Rajoy's position tenable?
He's been in a very shaky position since he was Prime Minister the first time. Somehow the guy has managed to survive. It's very interesting how he did it, but he's once again in a very difficult position. All
right, let's just put Spain to one side for now and just focus again on the German elections and the implications for the ECB and the broader European Union when you consider the inroads that the AfD have made and the fact that Schäuble is now taking a back seat. How do you see developments in Europe now within that context?
I mean, I think that I'm more optimistic about the German election than some of the other developments in Europe. I think Angela Merkel has played it very clearly from the beginning. She has been moving to the center to try to take the space of the Socialist Party, and she's been very successful with that policy. I do not think that she's going to go right because of the rise of the right in Germany. I think she's going to continue her course, it's worked very well, and I think she's going to be successful going forward. So I think this is, again, this is bad news for Germany and Europe, but I don't think this is going to take over German politics.
Antonio, we'll leave it there. Thank you, sir, for that analysis and those insights. Antonio Fatas there of INSEAD. Now, moving on, stateside, US President Donald Trump ramping up the rhetoric on North Korea, telling Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to save his energy and not to waste time trying to negotiate with Little Rocket Man. His words, not mine. The president tweeting, "Being nice hasn't worked over the past 25 years. Saying that Presidents Clinton, Bush and Obama failed to bring North Korea to heel, but that he would not. The tweets coming a day after America's top diplomat said Washington had reached out to Pyongyang to try and resolve the crisis via dialogue. It was the first time the Trump administration acknowledged it was in direct communication with Pyongyang. And President Trump plans to travel to Puerto Rico on Tuesday, and his visit now will be very controversial. On Saturday, he sent out a torrent of tweets defending his administration's response there and attacking San Juan's mayor after she put out a desperate plea for help on Friday. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell has more.
From the calm.
We will not rest, however, until the people of Puerto Rico are safe.
Like the eye of a storm.
But I'm there to help, I can tell you.
To the fury.
We are dying here.
An appeal from San Juan's mayor Friday appeared to trigger a torrent of tweets. The president leveled withering criticism. Such poor leadership ability by the mayor of San Juan. And judgment aimed at the people, American citizens hit by the hurricane. They want everything to be done for them when it should be a community effort, adding insult to an island's critical injury. Mayor Carmen Yulin Cruz, a Democrat, pushed back in TV interviews.
He can attack me all he wants. You know, bring it on. I'm here. It's about saving lives. It's not about politics. It's not about petty comments.
And counter-tweeted with photos showing herself in action, even waist deep in water. President Trump, spending the weekend at his New Jersey golf club, reappeared on Twitter about 6 hours after his angry burst with a different outlook. We must all be united in offering assistance to everyone suffering in Puerto Rico. And blaming media. Because of fake news, my people are not getting the credit they deserve for doing a great job. FEMA says it has deployed 10,000 to the island to help, while the president praised other Puerto Rican officials for their cooperation.
There's a growing criticism over President Trump's tax plan after the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center crunched the numbers and showed it would provide big benefits to the wealthy. The analysis also showed if enacted, the package would blow a $2.4 trillion hole in the federal budget. President Trump has praised the plan as a, quote, giant, beautiful, massive tax cut that will help American businesses grow. But speaking to US Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin on Meet the Press, NBC's Chuck Todd questioned how the plan would work, saying the administration would need to be like Houdini to keep all its promises and not drive up the deficit.
First of all, I think your characterization of similar to Houdini is just not fair. I've been working on tax reform with the president since the campaign. He's been very consistent on what his goals are. His goals are to get a middle-income tax cut. His goals are to make business taxes competitive. We have one of the highest tax rates in the world. We tax on worldwide income. We have a concept of deferral. This is really a jobs act. This is about creating jobs. And we've been completely transparent on the numbers and what this does to the deficit.
All right. Is the working class and the poor going to get a tax cut?
Absolutely. The objective is a middle-income tax cut.
The middle class is going to get a tax cut?
Absolutely.
Is the wealthy getting a tax cut?
The president's been very consistent. The objective is not to give a income tax cut to the wealthy.
Income tax cut.
That is true.
Because the estate tax is a tax benefit to the wealthy, correct?
The estate tax, also known as the death tax, okay? We believe that people should pay taxes once and not twice. So I separate the income tax system from the estate tax system. The purpose of getting rid of the estate tax is so that people that have farms and people that have family businesses can continue to pass those on.
So does anybody pay more?
Again, we'll go through the details as we have them. We'll have full transparency, but the president has been very clear, and I've been clear from the beginning. Our objective is not to create tax cuts for the wealthy. Our objective is about creating middle-income tax cuts. But as you know, one of the things we're trying to do is eliminate lots and lots of deductions. One of those deductions is about getting the federal government out of the business of subsidizing the states. So this will have different impacts to people in different states, and we're sensitive to that.
I want to go back. You are willing to have the president sign a tax reform bill that increases the deficit?
Not on a dynamic basis. So just to be clear, we fundamentally, businesses can continue to pass those on.
So does anybody pay more?
Again, we'll go through the details as we have them. We'll have full transparency, but the president has been very clear, and I've been clear from the beginning. Our objective is not to create tax cuts for the wealthy. Our objective is about creating middle-income tax cuts. But as you know, one of the things we're trying to do is eliminate lots and lots of deductions. One of those deductions is about getting the federal government out of the business of subsidizing the states. So this will have different impacts to people in different states, and we're sensitive to that.
I want to go back. You are willing to have the president sign a tax reform bill that increases the deficit?
Not on a dynamic basis. So just to be clear, we fundamentally believe that there are actions in the tax code that create economic growth. So no, the president is not going to sign something that he believes is going to increase the deficit. But that's different than on a static basis.
And there'll probably be a debate about what those numbers mean. You acknowledge the fact that not everybody's going to agree that this doesn't increase.
There should be a healthy debate on those numbers, and that's why we've had full transparency on what these numbers will be.
Was it appropriate that Tom Price was fired?
Again, I can't comment on he resigned. What I will say is appropriate is I think the American public deserve to know how their money is being spent and that it's being spent carefully.
Do you regret making the requests you made for government aircraft, whether it was to go to Kentucky? I know there's an inspector general on that one, or the request you made, which I know ended up withdrawn at the time. Do you regret doing that?
I don't, and let me tell you why. First of all of our travel went through the same process as previous secretaries of the Treasury. Mm-hmm. Every single one of my trips was approved by the White House. And the only time I've ever used or would use a private plane for government purposes if either there was a national security issue or we couldn't get somewhere. And that's what this is about.
So the Kentucky use of the plane was a mistake?
No, I never said it was a mistake. It was approved by the White House, and there were reasons why we needed to use that plane that are completely justifiable, and we look forward to the IJ report.
9 a.m. in Singapore and Hong Kong. Welcome back to the final hour of Squawk Box. I'm Sri Jagarajan.
Good morning, Sri.
Lovely to see you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Oriel Morrison right here in Singapore. Here's the headlines this hour.
Crisis in Catalonia. Catalan leaders open the door to independence after voters defy a violent police crackdown and choose overwhelmingly to break away from Spain. Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy declaring the referendum illegal.
Corporate Japan getting its groove back. The latest Tankan report shows big companies are feeling good, but the future not quite as bright with North Korea domestic elections looming large.
And Beijing helps out the little guy. PBOC frees up funds for banks that lend to small businesses but tries to keep that cash from adding to rising corporate debt levels.
All right, let's get to the markets right now and take a look at the ones that are up and running in the region right now. We've got a mostly positive picture there. As you can see, this is
away from Spain. Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy declaring the referendum illegal.
Corporate Japan getting its groove back. The latest Tankan report shows big companies are feeling good, but the future not quite as bright with North Korea domestic elections looming large.
And Beijing helps out the little guy. PBOC frees up funds for banks that lend to small businesses but tries to keep that cash from adding to rising corporate debt levels.
Let's get to the markets right now and take a look at the ones that are up and running in the region right now. We've got a mostly positive picture there. As you can see, this is, of course, the start of Q4 coming up today. And this is the overall numbers. The Singapore index is up by 0.4%. We've got Australia gaining by 1%. And the Nikkei, well, it's doing okay, up by 38 points right now. We did have a very strong Tankan survey out earlier this morning, better than expected, which is supporting the overall index. Some yen weakness over the weekend was also expected to support. Shri.
Yeah, let's get over to one of our top stories today that we are watching very closely, still developing arguably. Tensions remaining high in Spain after the central government cracked down on an independence vote in Catalonia. More than 800 people have been injured after riot police used batons and rubber bullets to try and stop the referendum from taking place. Nancy Hungerford joins us with more. And Nancy, it's just absolutely staggering, really, isn't it? And you would have thought that there is a process associated with this, regardless of the fact that an independence referendum is not enshrined in the Spanish constitution. You do not unleash the riot police against 70-year-old voters.
And that's one reason why many this morning are saying the government in Madrid, Prime Minister Rajoy, really should have just let this one play out rather than enforcing such a severe crackdown, because in many ways this did incite more people to go out and vote. That's simply one view. And if you go to our own website, we have a story up there, in fact, quoting one voter who did say herself, "I've always been against independence, but what the Spanish state is doing is making me change my mind." You can look at these images, and around the world now we're hearing from the likes of Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, in fact, calling out to the government here for their own repression. So certainly not a good day when you get Maduro suggesting that, in fact, the police response here was too severe. But in the government's defense, we have heard from members of the national government saying, in fact, the response was proportionate. A few hundred voting booths were closed in response to this action. From the very beginning, the government has said it is illegal, it is illegitimate, and that raises the question of what happens now, particularly as we know the Catalan parliament will be meeting to make this declaration of independence official. And then where do we go from here? How does the government respond in Madrid? Do they then give up additional concessions here? And it could take quite some time. I know you had a guest earlier on from INSEAD talking about just how long this uncertainty could weigh. Take a listen.
At a minimum, you have social disruption, strikes. That's at a minimum. In the worst case scenario, you're going to have a serious breakout of the country. You're going to have a serious economic crisis in the country.
There you have Antonio Foto speaking to you, Shri, a bit earlier. And let's talk about the economic impact that he was just mentioning there, because when you look at the economic impact, yes, on a population count, we're talking about some 16% of the population, but for the economic impact, 20% of Spanish GDP, about 23% of the Spanish industry itself based in the Catalonia region. And then on the exports, about 25% of Spanish exports. And this is significant because a big proportion of these exports do go through other areas of Spain, but about 66% are going to the EU. So another big issue here will be how the EU responds, because if we get to the stage of actual independence, which is still an if, we're talking about how would they then apply for membership of the EU. And the EU to this point has been very silent on the matter. So this raises the question of would they then apply for their own membership, and would the EU sign off on that? And many are saying that's not likely.
Well, you know, so the bottom line is that the Spanish government have called this referendum essentially illegal. Yes. You know, and Catalonia are basically saying, you know what, we've got 90% of the votes. But the majority of people that would have voted no are expected not to have even turned out. Correct. So you can't take the result of the vote as actually a clear indication either way.
Well, that's why turnout is so key here.
Exactly.
Noreen, you raise a good point. We say 90% have voted for independence. 42% was the voter turnout at say. That was higher than what we've seen previously. Remember, there was a referendum earlier, just over 3 years ago, that had lower turnout. It also wasn't binding. And the fact that Catalonia made this referendum binding, that's why so many questions still remain as to what happens next with the government's response. Where do we go from here? And like I said, there are questions over whether or not they may offer additional concessions on the tax issue, because one of the complaints coming from Catalonia is they give up so much to the budget. They say we don't get as much in return when it comes to the taxes they pay over to Madrid. So this is just one sticking point. And then there's also the question of the debt at stake here too, because when you look at the proportion of debt that Catalonia makes up, we're talking about some 16% of the overall Spanish debt. And some say if there were to be a break, if there were to be a border, would they write off that debt? Would that then become Spain's burden? And that certainly is something that Madrid would not go for. So many questions still to be worked out here.
And let's just pick up on Oriol's important point about the marginal voter. Yep. In my mind, there is a risk, and it is very early days, and let's wait and see how this develops, that this worsens, that this is going to radicalise, and this is going to embolden the Catalan movement. They're going to push even harder. They're going to dig their heels in harder as well, and it could very well have a domino effect for independence movements across the European Union. And let's not forget about the Scots Nats as well, and the possibility of an indie ref. So I think there are a number of moving parts here that the markets have to recognise, and that was a point that Rob Carnell of ING made earlier on today. This is what he had to say. Listen in.
You know, Spain is one of the biggest economies in Europe. I mean, we ignore it at our peril. You know, we tend to focus on France and Germany, Italy to some extent, the big three. You can't ignore Spain. It's a big one. And it's also one of the economies that post-crisis, post-European debt crisis, was one of the most active in engaging in the reforms, the restructuring that were absolutely necessary. It became one of the most dynamic economies in the region, and it really doesn't need this.
Can I also say, just super quickly, that I think that if this does worsen, then this has implications for the ECB and normalisation as well. And politics may be another reason that the ECB needs to stay in the game.
But not everybody agrees with Rob there. You know, talking about, you know, he was saying ignore Spain at your peril. I mean, listen to what David Quo said earlier on the programme, and he was saying it's really not going to have that big of an impact. Let's listen in.
I think it's going to have very little impact because, I mean, if you have a look at, say, the Eurozone itself, the impact that Spain has on the rest of Europe is probably sort of fairly minimal. I mean, the big powers there are, of course, Germany and France. And, of course, there is no real problem over there. Maybe one day there might be, but at the moment there is no problem with Germany and France. So I don't think, Spain is going to have that much impact. But what it could do, of course, is cause a kind of cascading effect, because there could be various regions within the Eurozone itself that might say, hey, maybe we want to have a breakaway.
It's not just the regions within the Eurozone either, it's other regions within Spain as well that, may turn around and look at this and go, what, they're doing it and they're having success, we might.
Watching very closely to see how this one pans out, certainly.
Can I just say this? I mean, I love David Quo like a brother, but I must respectfully disagree with him. I mean, if Cyprus and if Greece on the periphery can really spark a stampede in the global markets and dislocate markets and have the potential to cause such damage, then I think Spain could even be worse if this crisis really does deteriorate.
And it was interesting to say that he said there weren't any problems with Germany, because as we know, after the latest election results, there are some concerns about the anti-establishment vote. And I think it's difficult to draw parallels from Catalonia to other populist movements across Europe. But there is a feeling when you talk about the ECB, they must be looking on this and saying, wait a minute, we thought we had the politics settled. When you look at what happened in France, that's one reason we saw the euro run up after the French elections. They were saying things are calm, things are quiet. This is ultimately good when they talk about the structural reforms that the ECB has been pushing governments to get through for such a long time. And now when you get a situation like this, sure, maybe Catalonia independence in of itself doesn't move the ECB in one way or another, but it will have an impact on reforms in Spain. It will be a distraction for Mr. Rajoy when it comes to continuing the economic reforms that are already in play. And then you think, we've got the Italian elections coming up next year as well that many are already looking to, wondering what the populist effect will be. So I think there will be some concerns overall about the political environment that are drawn from this.
The politics are back and haven't been laid to rest. Ladies, thank you for that. And coming up on the programme,
with Christopher Brankin, the CEO of TD Ameritrade Asia. Chris, welcome. Thanks so much for coming on board.
Yes.
How much are you watching interest in Japan right now?
Well, a big focus for us is kind of where the currency is going. So now, if we get another round of Abenomics, if Prime Minister Abe stays in office, I think that's going to be positive to potentially kind of help stoke the economy in terms of we've seen kind of the 108.5 to the 115.5 basically all year for the yen. Now, if we get another round of Abenomics and some type of kind of weakening in the currency, I think that could help the overall economy. And another thing I think that they're looking at is what's going on in the U.S. with their tax reform, because that is greatly going to impact in terms of where their currency is going to go. So from us, it's kind of more look at it from the currency side of things to see where the economy is going. And then kind of on the other side of that coin is, what's going on around the Korean Peninsula. Like if we have, if it continues, the escalation continues any more than what it is right now, we could see, kind of strengthening in that currency as a flight to safety, which could pause, the kind of optimistic reports we've gotten out of Japan in terms of where their economy is going here in the near term.
When you look at the risk factors for Japan, where do you put this upcoming election? Because it seems to be a bit of a divide. Yes, the LDP and Prime Minister Abe's party is expected to maintain a majority. But if they have a very poor showing, that could certainly shake things up within his own party after the elections.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think the market would be kind of shocked if Abe isn't in office anymore after elections. At that point, I think you'd see some volatility kind of in the Japanese economy, stock market. So I think markets are pricing it in that we're going to see Abe continue on in office, but that's the kind of crux of it. If we don't see that, then that's where we see some real volatility.
Do you think the Japanese economy and specifically Japanese consumers, and to Akiko's point about household spending, can handle a higher tax burden, which brings into play the second phase of the GST increases?
I do, but I think a big part of that is, the health of, kind of what's going on outside of their borders, because they're an export economy, so if they get a stimulation from the U.S. side of things, I think would greatly help that.
You talked about the yen before, and you're really following this from the currency side of the equation. Is this more of a yen story now or a dollar story? I mean, the balance is not really there at the moment, because you've got the US tax reform story on the one hand and the fact we've got a strengthening dollar, and then, as you pointed out, you've got the uncertainty surrounding both the election but also the uncertainty and the tensions on the Korean Peninsula pulling the yen the other way. So which is the dominant force?
Look, they're really closely tied at this point. I mean, they're definitely, you hear it, they're working hand in hand, because they absolutely are. I mean, one's not going to work without the other, because they're, like, as we progress with the U.S. tax reform side of things, it's going to impact what's happening in Japan. And then as Japan's economy, whether it improves or stays where it's at this point, that could potentially have an impact in terms of where their yen is going. So it's getting pulled from both sides.
So neither one is dominant? Neither force is dominant?
I don't think, not at this point.
Not
I think the market's searching for clarity on that, but I don't think there's a dominant pulling factor at this point.
Okay.
Chris, we're not letting you go. We're going to get our pound of flesh. So after the break, we will talk to you about more Asian markets and possibly slip in a little bit of Europe and the US as well. Good man. Thank you for that. And my thanks to Kiko, of course, as well. Now then, a little bit thin on the ground this week because markets in China and Hong Kong are shut for the National Day holiday. But here's a look at the markets that have just come online this hour and how they are doing.
Well, the People's Bank of China has unveiled targeted cuts in the reserve requirement ratio for some banks over the weekend. It frees up funds for lenders that fund small business and the agricultural sector. The so-called RRR cut will vary depending on the size of the bank. Beijing wants to balance the support for the economy without putting pressure on already high corporate debt levels.
And that RRR cut coming as data out of China showed factories are still buzzing in the mainland. Manufacturing activity rising to 52.4 in September, fastest pace in 5 years. China's services sector also expanding with the non-manufacturing PMI rising to 55.4 last month. That was the highest level, actually, since 2014 and the first pickup in 3 months. Right, let's get back to Chris Brankin, CEO of TD Ameritrade Asia. Chris, how do we approach Chinese equities? Because you're in this context of deleveraging, no bad thing considering the debt, but it will weigh on growth. To what degree is it going to weigh on mainland Chinese equities?
Well, that's a mouthful, I guess, so to speak, in terms of where we're headed in terms of Chinese equities. So first, from this week, kind of an interesting week just with, China being shut, and we kind of see the end of last week, people were kind of taking that risk-off approach in terms of having exposure over a week that they couldn't trade. We've seen a decent story out of China in terms of their growth and their numbers remaining on kind of near target or above target for where they've been for most of 2017. Does that continue? I don't know. However, what we're seeing is our customers are kind of taking a little bit of risk off the tables and some of across China. Cost some of the Asian markets in general. Are they doing that specifically and moving it to the U.S.? Not at this point. So I think we see it from two sides. There's a little bit of risk-off approach. There's a little bit of money on the sidelines, but we do see kind of overall market exposures. We look for people adding to banks and the huge information.
In China.
Not just in China, it's just globally. So globally, I think banks and then information technology.
So this is what you do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, you follow these money flows, so you know where your clients are putting their money and when. You're saying you're seeing risk come off the table. Does that mean in overall, in general, you're seeing money coming out of Asia, not going on to the US? So where is that money going, or is it just sitting on the sidelines?
Well, look, there is some money on the sidelines right now. We do see some increased exposure in the US. We have seen it for basically every month of 2017 except for January.
Yeah.
So we have seen, some of that money flowing to our U.S. equities, and especially now if we have this Trump tax reform program pushed through, two kind of big areas of focus that we see our customers. The big U.S. banks are greatly going to benefit in terms of if we see some of this tax reform pushed through. And then the IT companies, because they're holding so much money outside of the United States. So if they get some of that repatriation tax, I think that's going to drive the U.S. markets, which is going to drive where that dollar flows are going.
Chris, it's a bit of a, to borrow expression from you chaps, a Hail Mary pass, though, on the banks and getting bullish about banks on deregulation and tax reform when it's been such a long time coming. You have political deadlock in a very divided Congress, and you have questions over how it's going to be funded, surely.
Sure. So look, I think there's a number of questions you get around that. And there's a couple ones that I get in particular. Like, what's the actual likelihood that it gets pushed through? And if it does get pushed through, what sectors are going to benefit the most? For me, I think we're going to see some type of tax reform pushed through. I don't know if we're going to get quite as much as this overall sweeping reform policy, because quite frankly, we need it in the U.S. We haven't seen a major one since 2001. The corporate tax code is outdated and it's not competitive with some of the other parts of the world.
Does that juice the Trump trade? Is it back on if and when that happens, or is it already in the price? Because look at valuations right now; they're so stretched.
Well, I think they're stretched a bit, but I think that rejuices that Trump trade. So I think what we see our customers even already adding on is the U.S. banks. We saw last week, we saw in the information technology, some of the Google, Apple, Microsofts kind of come off a little bit, but that was kind of quarter end, maybe taking some profit taking. So really interested to see where our customers are going this week in some of the big tech stocks.
So do you watch specific names? Can you tell which names that money's actually going into?
Correct. So
which is the biggest winner so far?
The biggest winner in terms of
what your clients are doing. So when they're taking money out, for example, of China or anywhere in Asia, Apple.
Yes, absolutely. Apple is has been, everyone is the smartest investor in the room if they just bought Apple for the last few years, because it just has gone up, up, and up, and we've seen increased money flow, increased exposure across Apple, across Google, across Microsoft. We've seen some large inflows as our customers have been adding exposure to those giant tech names. And if we do see that Trump trade come back on, these companies hold so much of their equity outside of the United States.
Repatriation.
There's $500 billion or more that we even know about. So it definitely would be. It would stoke the economy. It would stoke these companies in terms of their spending, in terms of where they're going forward. It's really interesting to see where the details are going with this, because right now we just have a blueprint.
Okay, something to watch, more to chat about. Chris, we'll be back with you again in just a little bit. See you soon.